Welcome to the klutchkittengaming podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so very glad that you're here for episode 45 of the show. Since we have a jam-packed episode, we're going to jump straight into questions. Today's question comes to us from Event1 Threads, who asks, if you could have any game made, what would it be? This is such a hard question, not only because it's incredibly broad, but also so many games that I want have already been announced or teased. An Elder Scrolls game has been teased, Breath of the Wild 2 is being made, Darkest Dungeon 2 is in development, Supergiant Games is in the middle of an early access with Hades, and a new Halo is coming next year. Oh man, I feel like I talk about XCOM 2 way too much, but I think my current answer might have to be XCOM 3. Give me more weapons, more customization, more enemies, more motherfucking dice rolls. If Firaxis does more of that, I'll be happy as a peach. I guess I could also approach this question by pitching my own game idea, but what fun would that be if it's not a secret anymore? Event1 Threads actually asked a second question as well, which is, what's the best console that you've owned? This is an interesting question because I've only owned 2 consoles in my entire life. Outside of PC, I've only owned a Switch and a Super Nintendo. Now, before you shut off the show and try to out me as a fake gamer, let me explain why. Growing up, my parents were not about the video games, so apart from PC Learning Company games like Operation Neptune and Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego, I was starved of gaming at home. Luckily, I wasn't shy and I ended up befriending people all through my schooling years who had consoles of their own that I wanted to play. Now that I'm an adult, I have actually started buying consoles for myself, but I'm still only at 2. So, ruling out PC, my favorite console has to be Switch. I originally heard people raving about the portability of Switch, but it wasn't until I purchased one that I realized how damn nice it was to be able to play big budget games literally wherever I wanted. There's not a whole lot to talk about in the news this week, but I'll mention 2 quick things. First of all, my wife and my new cat, Hibachi, he is currently sleeping while I am recording this, just over on a chair, and we are so excited. He is the cutest. Second, and slightly more importantly, I found an article that is both funny and interesting, and it's a piece by Joshua Rivera on Kotaku. The title of his article is Stop Calling Games Metroidvania. In the article, Joshua goes into an argument on why using the term Metroidvania is both ridiculous and quite uninclusive. The funny thing to me was how he parsed out where the word even comes from. Not only is the word Metroidvania a portmanteau, I think I pronounced that right, meaning it's a blending of 2 words, but the words that it's blending are also portmanteaus. Here's a quote from the article. Metroid, the story goes, is a combination of the words Metro and Android. Castlevania, meanwhile, is a merging of the words castle and Transylvania into something that worked out pretty well. Imagine stringing out all of those words individually. Metro, Android, Castle, Transylvania. I encourage you to read the article for yourself. It's an interesting look into how the gaming sphere has made something as simple and core as a genre into a complete clusterfuck of the word. Let's move on now to this week's game. I really need to get something off my chest. As you might know, I try to look at indie games that have been released within the last 2 years. I usually don't look at the dates games are ported to other consoles, but this week I decided to cheat and pretend this game came out in 2019. In reality, it came out in 2016 for PC, but it was just released on Switch in May of this year, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it. The game I'm referring to is called Valhalla, or, if you're reading it literally, VA-11, HA11A. A few of my friends on Instagram, most notably Pre, had been posting about this game recently, and I knew I had to try it out for myself. Valhalla is a visual novel and bartending game mashup set in a cyberpunk dystopia. It was developed by Sukiban Games, which is a Venezuelan games company founded in 2014. It was drawn and designed by Christopher Oritz, programmed and written by Fernando Damas, and the music was composed by Michael Kelly. Apparently the studio started because Christopher and Fernando had started writing a blog about anime and video games, and one thing led to another, and here we are. Currently Valhalla is available on most platforms and costs $14.99. According to howlongtobeat.com, it takes anywhere from 10.5 hours to 18 hours to beat, depending on if you're trying to get all of the endings. Control-wise, as long as you have a device that lets you click or push a button, you should be able to play this game just fine. It's mechanically very simple, so I wouldn't worry too much about what you use. Let's move on now to the narrative. You know, most people think that the success I find in my job comes from my incredible drink-making skills. That's what I thought at first too, but what I've come to find out is that my success comes from being a good listener. When a cocky businessman sits down at my bar, he could give less of a shit about what he's drinking. All he cares about is if there's someone who's willing to listen to him spew on and on about his accomplishments. When the anxious and depressed college student sits down at the next stool over, she would be just as happy with a big glass of tea at home, but what I am to her is a sounding board, a mirror, a cheap shrink. That's why I keep working at Valhalla. There's something so interesting about every single person who walks through those grungy doors, and I get to talk to them in their most vulnerable moments. In Valhalla, you play a bartender named Jill who works at a dive bar in Glitch City's downtown. The year is 2070-something, and you live in the dystopian future that many of you have probably heard about before. Body modifications are the norm, white knights keep the peace at all costs, corporations are the new mob, human consciousness is being uploaded to the web, and yet, even in the midst of all of this, somehow bartending hasn't changed all that much. There are still shitty people, messy patrons, dumb cocktail names, and an odd comfort in the quiet hum of neon and the friendship of acquaintances. This narrative setup might actually sound pretty familiar to you, whether you've played the Red Strings Club, or loved Blade Runner, or just watched the new trailer for Cyberpunk 2077. The whole cyber future isn't a new concept. So the question we need to ask ourselves is whether or not Valhalla does it justice. Does this game draw you into the world, or is it another trope-ridden title full of anti-corporate propaganda? I'm happy to say that this game has a very unique charm to it. For a majority of the game, you're experiencing the world through conversations you have with patrons. The rest of your time is mostly spent in your little apartment looking at blog posts and news. This isn't a game where you're walking the streets seeing what's happening. Your worldview is almost entirely built upon the understanding of those around you. And because of the way the game is structured, the focus is less on the story of the world and more on the relationships that you develop. You play through your days meeting new people and serving regulars, and little by little, you come to know these people better. You feel connected to them, and you get to see them at their best, and a lot of times at their worst. What makes it even better is that you're not just serving one type of person. You're making drinks for Alma, a hacker who can't seem to stay in a relationship, streaming Chan, an obnoxious IRL streamer, Donovan D, the stuck-up chief editor of the Augmented Eye, Dorothy, an eager robot sex worker, and many others. The fact that each person you speak with is wildly different really adds to the depth and realism of Valhalla. Yes, it does play into some character tropes, but overall it gives you a realistic demonstration of the complexity of people. Each one of us comes from a plethora of different backgrounds, and those shape a lot of our opinions and viewpoints on the world. What's also interesting about Valhalla is that it's a game of anti-heroes in a way. It's not a game about a knight in shining armor or a badass demon slayer. It's a story about a lot of fucked up people who are just trying to figure out their way in life. Before we wrap up our discussion of narrative, I need to mention a couple quick complaints that I have. First off, if you haven't picked up on it already, this game has a lot of mature themes. There's quite a bit of swearing and a surprising amount of dialogue about sexuality. There's most definitely a place for those things, but there were some points where I think the game went a little bit overboard on the volume of sexualized characters. My second complaint is in regards to Dorothy. My problem isn't that the devs put a robot sex worker into the game. It actually provides a lot of interesting storylines, but what rubbed me the wrong way was the fact that she's supposed to look young. There are some conversations early on where it makes it clear that she's an adult, but it also mentions that she was designed to look much younger than she actually is, like between 10 and 13 years old, basically implying that she's supposed to look like a minor to attract certain clientele. Yeah, pretty gross, and not exactly something I want to be processing while I'm trying to play a game. Aside from those two complaints, I think Sukeban did an incredible job of creating a compelling and intriguing narrative experience. For any of you who are also big readers, the narrative flow reminds me a lot of Donna Tartt's writing, which I find to be so good. So what do you actually do in this game? To be completely honest, you're mostly going to be pushing the A key, at least on the Switch, and reading. There is a lot of reading in this game, but you already knew that because it's partially a visual novel. Apart from reading, the main mechanic has to do with crafting cocktails. Unlike a game like the Red Strings Club where you can have endless hours of fun by dumping vodka all over the bar, the drink making system in Valhalla is much more orderly. When someone comes in and asks for a drink, you look it up in your recipe book and follow the instructions. Most cocktails are made up of some combination of 5 fictional elements: Adelhyde, Bronson extract, powdered delta, Flanergide, and Camotrine. In addition to having those ingredients at your disposal, some drinks are also blended versus mixed, others are aged, and others contain ice. Overall, the drink making system is pretty straightforward. Once you understand how to read the recipes and know that doubling the ingredients creates a big version of the drink, you're pretty well set. The nuance to this system really comes into play when patrons order their drinks. Often your customers give vague descriptions of what they want to order, or they order their drink with a riddle, or even just tell you to give them their regular. The recipe book really helps with those vague orders because it allows you to sort by descriptors like sweet, bitter, manly, and girly, but there were plenty of times where I couldn't just go to the recipe book and know exactly what someone wanted. I had to try and decipher their order. Apart from that adding a bit of depth to the mechanic, this also is your main way to have an impact on the narrative and dialogue. For example, you might get a different response from someone if you add a whole lot more Camotrine, which is the alcohol component, or if you purposely give someone the wrong drink. You might also take a different conversational path. If you're anything like me, when I heard about this, I was very excited. Being able to manipulate the game through a drink-making mechanic is awesome. Unfortunately, this is actually my biggest disappointment in the game as well. My issue is that there's never any indications as to what your drink choices have changed. In the case of the Red Strings Club, it was very clear what emotions your cocktails would play into. That allowed you as the player to make a conscious choice as to what you wanted the NPC to act like. In Valhalla, there aren't dialogue choices, and there's no guidance as to what changing the drinks will do. The downside to adding some sort of UI indicator or dialogue choices that show what your choices will do is that it can break down the immersion in the experience. In my case though, I think the fact that I knew I could have some effect on the game, but had no idea what effect I was having, that really broke my immersion even more than adding some additional UI element would have. Apart from that frustration, I did find the drink making to be a nice addition to the game. It helped to break up the flow of dialogue in a refreshing way, and it was complex enough without being overbearing or annoying. Now that we made it through the narrative and gameplay, let's discuss the art and sound design. I think Sukeban Games nailed the visual aesthetics of this game. A lot of the visual influence comes from old PC 98 games. It looks both futuristic and retro, which leads to an awesome visual style. There's lots of color, beautifully designed characters, and a unique look. When you start playing this game, you'll notice that there isn't a lot of character movement during dialogue, but one thing that's super cool is that characters do make small adjustments to their demeanor as you talk, which can help in your understanding of how they're feeling at any given moment. In terms of the sound design, I think Valhalla is worth the price just based on the soundtrack alone. It was composed by Michael Kelly, and it's hard to place exactly what the genre is, but there are a lot of futuristic synth sounds, and it really takes the game to a whole new level. At the beginning of each working day, you get to choose which songs get played in the jukebox, and you have a long list of tracks at your disposal. Not only does this mechanic allow you to listen to your favorites over and over and over again, it allows for more world building and immersion. You can choose songs based on what you think Jill will like or how she's feeling. There isn't any VO in Valhalla, but the soundtrack is truly wonderful. Whether or not you choose to play this game, make sure you at least take some time to listen to the soundtrack. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, the narrative and characters that Sukeban created are fascinating. There's an odd familiarity with the futuristic characters, and I think there's something comforting about the fact that the world of Valhalla is not so different than ours. There are a lot of messed up people in a messed up place just trying to find some peace in their life. Second, I appreciated the bartending system. It wasn't complex or crazy, but it was interesting enough to provide meaningful breaks from the long strings of dialogue. Third, the soundtrack for this game was superb. The dark and futuristic synth allowed me as a player to become enveloped into this game and world. It shut out any other distractions. I was locked in. When it comes to negatives, there are only two things that stand out. First off, the over-sexualization of some characters and the implication of Dorothy's character was a bit sickening and I think unnecessary. Obviously, being ignorant to the screwed up nature of some real-life people isn't the solution, but bringing narrative threads of inappropriate relationships into gaming doesn't seem like the answer either. Whenever Dorothy's character joined the conversation, I felt myself tensing up as I read a lot of the dialogue. Second, I was disappointed by the lack of clear choice in the game. Don't get me wrong, if Valhalla was meant to be a straight-up visual novel with no choice, I wouldn't be as annoyed, but the fact that you're supposed to have some agency in how the story progresses felt frustrating since there isn't any clear indication of your actual impact. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay this game. However, I do have one main caveat to the recommendation. If you dislike the visual novel genre, avoid this game. The bartending mechanic won't be enough to make you enjoy the experience. That being said, the overall experience of this game is incredibly unique and thought-provoking, and I think it's a game worth trying out. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen in. If you enjoy the show, there are two great ways to support it. First of all, go give the show a 5-star review on iTunes, and second, tell a friend about it. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in-game.